Probably one of my lead slides when I do invasive species talk is pictures of all the blooms, because that's what attracts everybody. We have to look beyond the bloom and the impact that that plant has.
Horticulture, is an art, a science, and a business, and we like to celebrate all aspects of that. Our Breedom mission is to connect people with plants. We grow over 4,000 different varieties here, and so we want to be an unbiased source of information to really see how these plants actually perform in a landscape. There are thousands of varieties of plants to choose that are both native and introduced species that are not invasive, nor do they show any invasive tendencies.
We need to define native, non-native, and that invasive term, because spicebush, it's a very aggressive plant, but it's not non-native invasive, and that's where we need to be certain we're making the right distinction.
That's why this is such a nuanced, complicated argument or discussion that we have, because we can show some benefit of exotics, and as long as they're not invasive, that's a good garden plant. If you're a tree in a city and you're in a hell strip, it's not a native environment. So we find these plants that are adapted to tougher conditions, but it's adapted to do well in other places too, and that's the definition of invasive. A plant has escaped cultivation, but yet this vector, birds or wildlife, carrying it into an environment where it's not wanted. It's not a native plant, and then it outcompetes the native plants.
Originally, Amur honeysuckle was introduced through the horticultural trade. Honeysuckle kind of came into Ohio in the sort of 60s and really started to become a problem in the 1980s. The reason that growers loved it was this really pretty plant. It had these beautiful white flowers, it had these really abundant berries, it grows super fast. All of those things that made it a really desirable species to plant actually kind of made it a real problem.
Horticulture is affected, and vice versa, what we grow and what our natural environments look like. We've become inundated with different choices. Over the last 20 to 30 years, breeding in horticulture has really become driven by marketing and sales, and it's more like a fashion.
If it's funny, if it's something you can eat or drink,
in the marketplace people will say, oh, I like the name.
I think that's something today that we have to be more cognizant of, that these landscape horticultural plants can move out.
The first thing that happens when you have an ecological invasion is that you get this monoculture of this plant, which is obviously removing the diversity and abundance of native plants. If you look at the understory, it's almost completely bare. There's very little native vegetation coming through. One of the crafty things about honeysuckle is it actually has allelopathy of the leaves. It's kind of chemical in them that can kind of stop native vegetation from growing while the plants are in place, but also once you remove honeysuckle, it can often be really difficult to get things like those spring ephemerals back because of the impacts on the soil. And subsequently after that, then you also have impacts on wildlife. It tends to reduce particularly bird biodiversity and abundance. You tend to lose specialist species from the habitat.
With there being thousands of varieties out there that grow well in Ohio in our landscapes, there's still a tendency for consumers, for folks to use the same plants that maybe they've known their whole lives. It's sort of an inertia effect where if it worked for 40 years for my mother, it's going to work for me. Or I go to a big box store and they have a lot of them, or they're on sale, they're cheap. I think that perpetuates the issue with some of these plants being overused that are also invasive plants. A lot of New England states have already banned Japanese barberry and burning bush for that reason. So there are a lot of native areas in the Northeast and in New England that have just become colonized with Japanese barberry and with burning bush. We're seeing that with calorie pear, and of course now Ohio has moved to ban calorie pear, and hopefully that'll start to abate the problem. But it's like a Pandora's box. Once you open it up, you can't put it back in.
So you can actually see this kind of path here marks the boundary of an area where we removed invasive Amur honeysuckle, marked with an area where we didn't. And you can really say there's a very big difference in the structure of the forest. We probably managed to clear somewhere in between a quarter and half an acre. This is a really small area in the grand scheme of things. So if you had like a really heavily invaded natural forest ecosystem, managing it is a really long-term game, because you've got to think about the initial removal and all the time associated with that. You've got to think about follow-up control. You've got to think about replanting, which is super important because you want to try and put native species back in there that are going to sort of outcompete invasives in the long run and provide greater biodiversity and benefit wildlife. I think one of the saddest things about it is just the extent of the level of invasion that's taken place with Amur honeysuckle. Controlling it is just, I mean, it's really overwhelming, and this is just essentially one of a number of different invasives. You know, land managers in this state are dealing with lots of different ornamental invasive species that were originally introduced in a similar way to Amur honeysuckle. It's really critical that we think deeply about what kind of plants we add into our landscapes, into our gardens.
And that's the answer to a lot of these, is plant something else that's more responsible. You know, I would never advocate for only natives. I would never advocate for only non-natives. You know, I'm a horticulturist, and we create things that function or are beautiful and people enjoy, and that takes all the crayons in the box, not just half.
Try to go with plants that have been around a long time and we're not seeing issues with. There's different varieties of magnolias that aren't native, but we haven't seen them in the 15, 20 years that they've been planted as landscape plants move out into the native areas.
The horticulture industry as a whole is, you know, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, and at some level it does have responsibility. So it is sort of governing what is coming out on the market, and there will always be that struggle between profitability and sort of ecological responsibility.
People have such a power to make a big difference just by going out and demanding what they want. So even going to your gardening centre and asking for the native species that you want, asking for advice on native species, that can create a big impact.
Up until very recently, nurseries did not promote something as native. Now, native plants, it's almost a marketing tagline that folks will come in specifically looking for natives because of the benefits. You know, they want to attract native wildlife, etc. I think there has been an industry shift towards native plants. I think the general public is aware that you know, we need to be mindful of the choices we make, and that involves plants as well.